And you were live.
Good morning, everyone. It's that time again. I know we're a little late. Typically, we're on Monday, but thanks to me and CJ being in two different parts of the country, and no, we had nothing to do with the untimely death of the Sith Lord himself, David Rockefeller. We had nothing to do with that, and that is not the reason why we were not around on Monday, which was happened to be Freedom and Peace Day. But we were taking a little bit of a respite. But we are back in the saddle this morning, and because of yesterday's events. London Paul will be on with us right now. And Paul's on. If you haven't got a chance, check out his website, thesiriusreport.com. You not only need to go there, but you need to subscribe. Look, the most important thing is having a daily intelligence brief that gives you the rundown of the most important topics that are shaping the world today. Folks, let me tell you something. Culture and politics is downstream from economics, okay? And Andrew Breitbart said that politics is downstream from culture. Well, I'm telling you right now, economics, okay, culture and politics and all the things that you see in this world is downstream from economics. The whole saying, follow the money. So if you want to know what's going on in the world, nobody follows the money better than London Paul. Check out his premium subscriber service over at the Sirius Report. We don't get a penny out of promoting it. We promote it because we believe in the work that Paul does. He's an absolutely brilliant mind and one of the top sources in order to understand what's going on today. God, I'm getting into a mental fog over here. But anyway, with that out of the way, Paul, welcome, man. How are you?
Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Yeah, I'm very well, and yourselves?
I'm hanging in there. I'm rested. I'm relaxed. I feel great. I actually woke up today at 5 in the morning. I actually went to go work out and try to get my health back on track, so I'm feeling good.
Excellent. That's good to
Absolutely. Then I came back and down 2 cups of coffee. So I'm feeling even better.
hear.
Oh man, Paul, it is going crazy. Okay, it is going crazy. I mean, where do you want to begin? We had the explosive news on Friday, which we've covered on the show a little bit, and you were in the chat room at that time, and I couldn't wait. I couldn't wait. I was even inviting you while I saw you in the chat room. Please come on if you can. But you know what? I couldn't wait to have you on today to discuss all the news that is coming out of China. I guess we can start there, and then we can go into Tillerson, the whole NATO EU thing, and
Yeah.
then get into the soap opera that is the United States, that is Washington D.C.
Excellent. Okay. Well, yeah. Obviously, Jim Willie kind of that broke the whole kind of what was going on with the Shanghai Gold Exchange. But if we take a step back 12 months ago, and it literally is 12 months, less maybe a week or so, it was brought to my attention at that point that China was going to announce the gold-backed yuan. And I know we've mentioned this before, but it's worth putting it in context. And of course, Washington at the time said, well, that's a declaration of war, and China went, okay, we're going to back off. We're not going to go through with this. And sort of what precedes that as well is if you go back to around 2012, for about 3 years, maybe even longer, every single month, 1,000 tons of gold was heading east, and it was going via London, which is kind of like a pooling place. It was shipped off to Switzerland, where it was refined into kilo bars. And then it was going east, predominantly China, some to Hong Kong, etc. But the vast majority to China. So obviously we all were way back that China was accumulating huge amounts of gold. So they have probably at least 30,000 tons now, and so does Russia. So come the sort of day of the Feds and the whole interest rate debacle, and we can talk a little bit about that, because from my perspective, that was not an interest rate hike, and I'll explain why shortly. So, okay, so I'm watching the gold markets thinking, well, it's inevitable, there's going to be a smash on the gold price. So what actually happened is, well, Shanghai led the way and sort of hiked the price. And I'm thinking, okay, what's going to happen? And immediately thinking, well, there's going to be some smash. Of course, it never happened. Other COMEX and LBMA just rose in sync with it, albeit there's a slight arbitrage, but nothing really worth speaking of. Now, I've never seen that from what I can view in terms of looking at gold markets and the silver market for that matter, which obviously rose correspondingly. I think it was about 3% on the day, and gold was about 1.5%. Of course, it rose the following day. So for me, I was starting to see this fundamental break in between obviously the physical market in the East, which is buy an ounce of gold, and it's backed, by an ounce of gold, not rather than buying an ounce of gold in the paper markets, and it's backed by fresh air. So I started thinking, well, okay, are we on the cusp of seeing this fundamental break in the Western paper markets? And then I started to look around at other factors that were coming in. Well, I didn't see any spike in bond yields. So there wasn't anybody dumping bonds. The markets kept rising, which normally in a situation that you'd expect there to be a sell-off in the market. So all these economic or kind of in inverted commas indicators through the markets suggested the contrary was happening. Then I became aware that there are major structural changes coming soon in the gold and silver markets. So when you started to stack all that up, I then went, okay, well, clearly, to some extent, the Chinese have lost patience with the Fed and the cabal, and they have to be careful about this. They know full well what Trump's trying to do. They know Trump's trying to take a wrecking ball to these and all the other cabal establishments across the US. So they're not so concerned, but they're kind of a little bit concerned and saying, well, okay, something needs to be addressed here. So it's almost as though have the East started to take more of a controlling influence. Now, the only way, from my perspective, they'd want to do that is when they felt pretty much they'd exhausted the West gold supply. Because the whole point was, since even before 2012, was to drain the West of literally every ounce of gold they could get their hands on. Now, I also obviously became aware probably 6 months or so ago that if on a retail level, if you want to go in and buy a store and buy an ounce of gold, you're going to pay a premium, but it's not a huge amount. We've all had that experience with buying an ounce of silver. But if you go out into the big outside world and I say I want to buy a metric ton of gold,
oh yeah, premiums through the roof.
Then you were paying probably double the price, maybe $2,500 an ounce equivalent. Well, now exactly. It's got to the point. If you want to buy a metric ton of gold, you are really struggling. You cannot buy it. That's Correct. How tight the supplies become. So, was that another indication of this kind of shift in policy from Shanghai? They clearly were aggravated and irritated by this kind of rise in interest rates. They don't want to see it. Trump certainly doesn't want to see it. Now, of course, the argument ultimately be that the biggest revenge China could do is suddenly one day say to the world, well, we've got 30,000 tons plus of gold. We're going to launch a gold-backed yuan and the rebirth of the gold standard. And, of course, that would send shockwaves. But they don't really need to do that at that point. And there's no point creating shockwaves. But you kind of felt that we were on the sort of cusp of some watershed moment. Time will tell precisely. I mean, thus far, it's behaving how I'd expect in that regard. Now, regards to the interest rates with the Fed, now, obviously back in December 2015, they kind of look like, we had this kind of rate hike scenario, but there's a thing, and I'll explain what it is because people may not have heard it, but they may have heard people like Jim mention it, which is reverse repos. Now, when you have a reverse repo, which is a reverse repurchase agreement, basically the Feds will sell a security to some counterparty with an agreement to repurchase that same security at a specific price and a specific time in the future. So obviously there's going to be a difference between the sale price and the repurchase price. Now, what that does is, together with the length of time between the sale and the purchase, it implies a rate of interest paid by the Federal Reserve on the transaction. Notice the reference to the implication of interest paid by the Feds. Now, this is what they did back then, which was kind of this pseudo interest rate rise. I think that's exactly what they're doing again, which might explain why we're not seeing this huge bond sell-off, which would spike the yields. We're not seeing the stock market being, sell off in that regard, which I would have expected to see as well. So I think there might be a bit of smoke and mirrors with regards to that. And of course, we only have to listen to what Yellen said. I mean, when we talk a bit about what Comey was talking about yesterday in the congressional hearing, but my God, what Yellen said was cringeworthy and embarrassing. To refer to GDP as some noise. It's a noise, which is probably the most important indicator if it was a true reflection of economic growth. And she said, oh, well, It's noisy. Well, yeah, it's noisy probably because it's being rigged so badly, because the reality is the GDP is probably 3 or 4% less. I mean, I don't think there's any Western nation who's not been in recession for 8 years, with whatever they like to say to the contrary. So overall, yeah, I think it might be a watershed moment. I don't want to get too excited about what happens. You have to watch what happens in the coming weeks and months. But because I said we went through that scenario 12 months ago, and I didn't say anything at the time because, well, okay, there's no point saying it, and I'm glad I didn't, because if I'd said there's going to be, gold back yuan announced, then everyone would have gone, hang on, it never happened. So, and I'm not suggesting it is going to happen in the next week or two, because I don't know. But what we can say is there are some major structural changes coming out, I think, in the gold and silver markets, which will principally revolve around the demise of the COMEX and the LBMA. And I know a lot's been said about, well, certain players in those markets are leaving and joining. Well, it's just a revolving door. I'm not really that concerned about who joins and who leaves and who goes and stays. It's overall what's going to happen in reality to the actual market itself. So, and I think at some point, the Shanghai Gold Exchange takes the dominant view and says, well, you're going to have your ounce of gold is backed by real gold, not this backed by paper nonsense. And I've looked at all the kind of stats in the COMEX, and I'm not seeing any huge interesting things that suggest we're seeing any massive change in that regard. But I keep a tally on that kind of once or twice a week just to see if there's any big changes. But we're not really seeing anything. But of course, the ratio between paper and gold, I mean, at one time it was as high as 200 to 1. I think it's down about 30 to 1, 25 to 1 currently, which just shows the farcical nature of it. But it's interesting with the whole thing. We subsequently kind of come out from the whole issue with the interest rates and what happened in the gold market. And then I start to think, well, is that a kind of a watershed moment? And then we start to look at what happened subsequently, with regards to Trump and Merkel, and then that whole kind of fiasco. And we can talk about that now, or maybe we can park that and talk about something else. But that's the kind of, for me, was another kind of natural conclusion that certain things happen, and you kind of think, well, does that relate to anything? And often it doesn't obviously do so, but then subsequently you start to see this whole chain reaction of events start to happen. And I think that there's a number of hugely interesting things which we can discuss that have happened, obviously subsequent to that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when you look at the Insolvent Seven, and they're always talking about their GDP numbers, this, that, and the other, and for her to say it's noise, I mean, look at the U.S. GDP numbers. We're one of the only countries in the world that counts government expenditure as a net growth. It's the craziest thing in the world, Paul. That's like me emptying my checking account and telling my wife, "Hey, honey, I just increased my net worth. I wiped out our entire savings." I mean, that's in essence, that's what it is, Paul. It's like you have to look at it in a serious sense and say, "Hey, you know what? Maybe 50%, maybe 40, maybe 30." Maybe like 40, who knows? Maybe 30 to 50% of these GDP numbers that are coming out of the U.S. is nothing but reshuffled debt with magic multipliers and fictitious forecasting in a bubble.
Oh, absolutely. That's why I'm convinced it's 3 or 4% higher than it actually should be.
Yeah, at 1,000%.
I mean, it may be even worse. I don't know. I mean,
absolutely.
But that's a conservative estimate. But you can see, I mean, the tail off in GDP, even from the Fed's figures, shows the GDP is falling off a cliff edge. And at that precise moment, they go, oh, well, I think it's a great idea. Let's raise interest rates. Well, everyone knows you raise interest rates to cool an overheating economy. Well, forgive my crude understanding of economics, but I don't see any great heating up in the US economy. It's quite the reverse.
Correct. Exactly correct. And, I mean, all the numbers are fictitious. We all know the job numbers are fictitious. We know the GDP numbers are fictitious. We don't even have a $16 trillion economy. No, we probably maybe 3, maybe 5 trillion at the most, Paul. That's the real numbers of our economy. Our growth rate with all the magic multipliers applied, and all the mystical arithmetic applied to, multiple seasonal adjustments to job figures and whatnot, our economy, it's barely growing at 1% with all the magic multipliers and all the manipulation and all the fictitious data. You barely can see a 1% growth. I mean, come on, it's ridiculous.
No, absolutely. And just look at the number of people who are economically inactive, nearly 100 million. I mean, how does that stack up with 4.9% unemployment? I mean, it's fast, and all the economic reality, all the statistics that come out, and we talk about it on the podcast from time to time. We'll highlight stuff to do with, you look at the real estate markets. I was talking to CJ just before we came on air, and you look at what's happening in the US. You look at commercial real estate, everything's collapsing. And yet somehow they managed to produce these incredibly warped statistics that suggest, oh, everything's fine. But, at the end of the day, the Fed's whole raison d'etre now is, well, the Dow, it's at 20,000. Well, if the Dow gets to 25, the world's fine. And yet you can see just how rigged it is when you look at the S&P in terms of, that's at record highs or near enough. And the earnings per share in companies is falling off a cliff edge. But hey, that doesn't matter because the markets are doing fine and they're dragging retail investors in while institutional investors are dumping. Well, we've seen that many times before in history. So the poor guy woman like you and I stood there going, oh, hang on, I'm holding this falling knife that's collapsing. And of course, people panic, sell out, and make massive losses. And this happened, in 2008 too, around that, before the crash. I mean, if you think the markets were starting to overheat, probably in 2007, but a lot of people thought, oh, it's just a correction. I mean, how many times have we heard that fictitious word? This is just a market correction. Yeah, it'll drop a few percent. Yeah. But at some point, of course, it won't. And we can't say when. I mean, you pointed out, and it's true, maybe the Dow will just keep going 25, 30, 35. Who knows what they'll do?
I think so. I think you look at what's happening. Look, the raising of the interest rates ever so slightly, they could juice the numbers as much as possible to infinity on the stock market. They don't have that level of stretchability, that level of fungibility that they have in the bond market. They don't have it.
No.
I think what's going to happen with the continued cracks and the bubble that's in the bond market, which everybody knows, we've known about it for years, Paul, and everybody's like tiptoeing on it, they're walking on eggshells when it comes to the bond market. I believe what's going to happen is this: they're going to have to put the people fleeing out of the bond market somewhere. And that is why they are juicing the stock market to sky high, because that's where it's going to go. It's the inevitable. And fools rush in where angels fear to tread, Paul.
Yes. No, absolutely. And of course, often when you're at the rock bottom, people are terrified to buy, which is when they should have bought back in. You had the 2008-9 kind of market crash. And I remember March, April 2009, people were terrified to buy in, and that was the time to buy stocks because they're just at rock bottom. I mean, they really were ridiculously underpriced at that time. Yeah. So yeah, you always have the reverse indicator from a retail person like you and I investing in the markets, but undoubtedly there is a major crisis. I mean, everything's a bubble. So, and of course the Fed, look at the Fed, their balance sheet's an enormous bubble, and they're going, well, we haven't quite decided yet how we're going to start to deflate our balance sheet. I mean, who the hell's going to buy those assets? No one. And they're not even assets. Most of them are really like just liabilities, like despite the fact that they're portraying them as assets. So that's a huge problem. And of course, we didn't have that issue in 2008, which just exacerbates the problem, multifold.
Yeah, absolutely correct. And it's what's remarkable is at some point somebody's going to pull the curtains back at the paper West and realize that there is nothing there to back up any of these instruments that they have floating out there, where they were selling into the world as an A1 grade investment all over the world. And that day is fast approaching, Paul. And again, that news out of China, it's massive. It's world altering, man.
Well, I mean, now's probably a good point, to start to look at it. Okay, here's some economic things that are going on, but what's the kind of geopolitical significance? Well, undoubtedly, Merkel went to the US. Okay, she delayed a trip because of the weather and turns up on Friday, probably expecting, oh, well, Trump's going to back off over the NATO. The fact we haven't spent anywhere near what we should have in terms of percentage of our GDP. Who cares? He'll be fine about that. He's not going to be interested in having a trade war with us. He'll be supportive. And you only have to look at the body language of that press conference when one of the press corps said, are you going to have a handshake? And Merkel turns to Trump and says, are we going to have a handshake? And he just ignores her. And that is probably one of the most damning diplomatic incidents I've ever seen. I mean, how much more can it be obvious that Trump has no time for Merkel whatsoever? So what does that, I mean, Germany's always had, the full support of Washington, largely because it was carrying out Washington's policies, but it had the support, and there was always this backstopping of the ECB and all kind of NATO support, and Germany felt very comfortable. So what happens? Merkel obviously goes home with absolutely nothing, with no reassurances. I mean, despite all the rhetoric, yeah, we had great talks. Yeah, probably from the US perspective, it was a great talk because they put Merkel back in the box and said, go away, we're not interested in talking to you. So what immediately happens? Merkel goes home and she probably straight away gets on the phone to Putin and goes, you know what, let's bury the hatchet. Russia's a great country. You can help us. We need you on the world stage. Because now she's panicked because she's stuck in a vacuum. If the US cut the strings, she's left floating around in Europe, which is a mess, as we know. And then she's going to turn around and go to Russia. Well, I need an ally. And of course, at some point in the future, forget Merkel, forget everything, Germany will naturally rotate towards the east. It has been, we've talked about this, there's private talks ongoing, they're still ongoing. Merkel's not part of it because Merkel's not part of the solution. So Putin will sit there and go, well, this is great, but you know what? We're going to do this on our terms. We're not in any rush. We don't need to rush with you. We're just going to let you sink all by yourself. And at some point, yeah, we'll be there to pick up the pieces and help Germany in the future, as will China. But at the moment, they don't need to put their foot down, and why should they? So effectively, Merkel's now totally isolated. She's isolated on a world stage because the US doesn't want to bother with her. Neither does the Russians at this time. The Chinese don't care either. And Europe's sinking fast, as fast as any of the kind of economic unions that exist in the world. So she's in a very, very precarious position and has got nowhere to turn.
Right. Exactly. And since the sanctions that the lunatics that are in Washington, D.C., the sycophants who are hyperventilating over the fact that, oh my God, Russia's expanding. Oh my God, Russian involvement. These lunatics, they are happy to hit Russia with these sanctions. And these sanctions have done nothing but ravage the European economy. Germany, 600,000 jobs were affected because of these Russian sanctions. Over 6,000 German companies do a great deal of business with Russia. They've all been affected. It's hurt Germany more than it's hurt Russia. It's hurt Italy more than it's hurt Russia. It's hurt Austria more than it's hurt Russia. These countries are taking a hit because of these faceless bureaucrats who sit in their ivory towers, who are so far removed from reality, Paul, that they're making decisions that have ramifications that they think that they are the masters and they can figure it out, and the world bends to their whims. It's incredible.
Well, of course, the big mistake they made was, well, a number of mistakes concerning Russia. First off, they underestimated the Russian economy. Yeah, the Russian economy's been in a pretty bad shape for a long time. But Russia was already starting to step out of that dark shadow when the whole Ukraine, Maidan happened. And of course, that was part of the plan. Let's suck Russia in. They're bound to fall for this. They're bound to invade. It's going to cause World War III, whatever else they thought would happen. Of course, didn't bank on the fact that Putin's got a brain and said, well, actually, I already knew you were going to do this, but we're not going to get involved. You can do what the hell you like, because in the end, you're going to back off and leave the country with your tail between your legs. And that happened some way back where Newland was invited to Russia and told basically get out and stop meddling in this country. Subsequently, to a large extent, the US is no longer meddling. In the process, Ukraine's collapsing. Poroshenko is despised by just about everyone. Privately, he doesn't want any part of this, but he's got no support because the US doesn't support him anymore. It's rather a bit like Merkel. Trump said, I'm sorry, we're not supporting you. This is just, you may have got the support of the previous administration, but forget it. We're not getting involved in this mess. So they made two big howling mistakes there. They also, of course, didn't bank on the fact that because Russia already knew, they went, okay, if you want us to de-dollarize, yeah, we'll happily de-dollarize. And by the way, we're making trade agreements with all these other nations in the process. So we'll survive the economic fallout of this. It's not going to affect it. And you know what? Ironically, Russia at the moment is saying to the West, it's up to you. You can come with your cap in hand regarding the sanctions. Just leave the sanctions in place. It's not affecting us. We don't care. It's not. In fact, our economy is thriving because we had the intelligence to diversify our economy anyway, irrespective of sanctions.
Right.
So they made a howling mess in that regard, and you're absolutely right. Germany's livid because there are hundreds of Russian companies in Germany, and Germany actually has thousands in Russia. And they've all been hit by the economic sanctions, and Germany's economy is beginning to suffer. And of course, the whole debacle regarding the whole immigration policy, which Trump's absolutely right. Merkel has ruined Germany. She's ruined it economically. She imposed an immigration policy which we all know was deliberately intended to cause mayhem in the European Union. And it was by design, because I knew, as I said before, I've known a couple of years before it happened, it was going to happen, because it was all part of a cabal plan to wreak havoc in the European Union. And it has caused a huge problem, and that problem's not going to go away anytime soon. So when you look at that, and of course, yeah, the Dutch elections, everyone went, well, you know, it was a bit of a failure for Wilders. Well, I covered this off, and I won't go into masses of detail. So I did do pretty extensive coverage in one of the podcasts which explained the reality. It's far from a victory for Rutte, anything but that. And now, of course, Le Pen is edging ahead in the presidential elections, and by all accounts, rather like Trump, who was 30% ahead, despite what everyone may have been told to the contrary. Le Pen's actual votes probably 10% higher, so she's way ahead in terms of these presidential. And the other candidates are kind of mired in problems themselves, although admittedly they're trying to drag Le Pen into that and accuse her of all sorts of things, because just trying to muddy the entire waters. But if Le Pen obviously gets elected, that's going to weaken Merkel even more. And what do the Germans have? I mean, you get Merkel or Scholz. I mean, you wouldn't want either of them. I mean, who have they actually got who can run the country? I mean, Steinmeier's been elected as the prime minister, but I think he's a good guy. He's very pro-Russia. He's very pro-China. He's anti-sanctions, and he's very kind of skeptical of what's going on with the European Union. But he has no power. He can't do an awful lot. I mean, yes, he went off and had a chat to Putin last year, which caused major consternation to Merkel, because what the hell's he doing that? Well, we know exactly it's part of those kind of negotiations that Merkel's not part of. But it all plays into the hands that ultimately, you know, if you went back to 2014 and said in 3 years' time, the Russian economy is going to be stronger, NATO is going to beg the Russians to get involved and sort out the problems in Ukraine, that Crimea would still be part of Russia, that the German economy would be suffering hugely, people would have laughed and said, this is impossible, it can't happen. But we should be grateful that the cabal had this delusional view that was going to happen. But of course, what they failed to appreciate and still do is Putin is way smart. I mean, he is the kind of grandmaster chess player who, and yeah, he's got a team, don't get me wrong, it's not just Putin, but they are 100 moves ahead of whatever the cabal think they're going to achieve. And of course, now they're on the ropes, and a lot has happened. And in some ways, the whole Ukraine Maidan was probably the moment when Russia and China went, that's it, we've had enough. You've pushed your luck too much. We've been patient with you. You know, you've set the bar too high, and that was the whole moment when the whole massive de-dollarization came about, when Russia and China spent the last 3 years visiting every country, signing trade agreements, signing military agreements, and you know, the rest history. So if we look back, and a lot of people probably would think, well, that wasn't really a turning point for me. It was the huge turning point, really, in ultimately in speeding up and accelerating the demise of, well, cabal, deep state, whatever you want to call it. It doesn't really matter. It's just a word. But that for me was the massive changing point.
Yeah, I just lost audio.
I'll let you reconnect.
Well, I can hear you okay.
So that was a very interesting take, Paul, in regards to Germany and Merkel and how the French election is going to affect everything. And obviously, you know, the Trump-Merkel meeting, what were your thoughts on that?
Oh, yeah, exactly. It was an utter debacle. I mean, there was nothing. Merkel went away with nothing. And of course, the whole handshake incident just exemplified the problems. And then, of course, conversely, there was that moment where he kind of made the quip. Well, the one thing we do have in common, because he was referring to the wiretapping business, which obviously was the situation where it was proven that Merkel was being wiretapped for a period of time. And he, you know, there's this idea, well, was he wiretapped, or in inverted commas? Of course, what happened is he made the reference, that's the one thing we've got in common, not, well, actually, we've got a lot of other things in common. So that was another kind of slight and insult aimed at Merkel. And I think there was the bit, I saw a picture where Merkel was sat in this trade meeting next to Ivanka Trump, and the look she was giving her was just priceless. I mean, they just put Merkel it basically in a position where I mean, that's about as near as you can to humiliating a chancellor or leader of a nation and sending them home packing. I mean, you couldn't do it anymore if you tried, really, in reality.
Exactly. Paul, could you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you fine.
Oh, okay, good. I had some audio issues on my end. Oh, absolutely correct, man. I mean, these old fuddy-duddies who are just so used to just taking up space and sitting in their bureaucracies for decades on end where nothing gets done, where they just go to these windbag services where they just blow hot air on each other all day long. They're not used to this type of shellacking. They're not used to this absolute demolition of their entire systems because it simply doesn't work anymore. It simply is not working. And you know what? It's I've said this before, Paul. The only way the United States is going to survive is for us, thanks to Trump, is for him to allow us to rapidly build a physical economy as fast as possible. It's the only thing that can inoculate us from a massive crash. And well, I mean, we're still going to go, and rather than facing a massive crash, we're going to go through a severe economic correction, which I'd rather have than a massive crash.
Oh, I absolutely agree with you. I've said this before. His biggest problem is it's like turning a huge oil tank around on a dollar, or so to speak, or a pound. It's very, very difficult to affect change, because any changes he kind of makes now will probably take a year to really filter into the mainstream economy. But he's absolutely aware, and this is fact. He knows full well what the problems are. He knows economically what the issue is. He knows what's coming down the track. He knows the US will have a devalued dollar. He knows the gold standard's coming. He knows China and Russia have way more gold. He knows economically what's going on globally and geopolitically. He's fully aware of this. And this is probably why, and it's a good point to make, is Tillerson. Now, Tillerson, who's obviously a US Secretary of State, he's planning to skip a meeting with NATO foreign ministers in early April in order to stay in Washington to prepare for a visit by, the Chinese president. So he's going to miss his first meeting of 28 NATO allies so that he can attend Trump's, meeting with the Chinese President Xi Jinping, which is going to be at Trump's resort in Florida.
Right.
Now, sorry, just barely. Sorry about that. NATO is reported as saying they would reschedule the meeting, but the US has refused the offer. And then just to kind of rub salt into the wound, Tillerson's planning a visit to Moscow soon after Xi's visit to the US. Now, what does that tell us? Rather than having a meeting with NATO foreign minister, but we need to put this in context, because someone's bound to say, well, actually, he's having a meeting in the next few days with some NATO ministers. Yeah, but they're just focusing purely on the whole, how are we going to defeat the Islamic State?
Right.
That is not a full meeting. He's going to bypass a full meeting to say, do you know what? I'm sorry, with all due respect, at this point in time, you NATO members are irrelevant. You're of no relevance to me. I need to go off and talk to the Chinese and to the Russians, because at the moment they're far more important. And I think this is partly also because Russia's now getting signals from NATO saying, we want to bring you in from the cold, out the cold. It's time that we have to talk to you. And Russia said, okay, well, what do you want to talk about? Give us some concrete plans. And Russia's going, well, come on. And there's nothing. NATO's terrified, doesn't know what to say, says, oh, please talk to us. And Russia's saying, well, we need some concrete plans. And of course, they don't have any, because this is the thing now. NATO's kind of in a situation where the cabal strings have started to be cut, and there's no one in these positions constructive decisions. But Russia will say, well, we'll talk to you, but you're going to have to come with something more constructive. But again, Russia has all the time in the world to wait for NATO to come back with something. And Russia wants the US to play a more constructive role in Syria, and we're starting to see evidence of that. The United States has been invited to a peace conference to do with Afghanistan in Moscow. So the US has been invited to participate in things. Tillerson's bypassing NATO, and people say, oh, NATO's strong. Well, how strong is NATO when the US is bypassing and saying, we're going to talk to the major players in the world, which is Russia and China? And people need to obviously be mindful. That doesn't mean in a kind of dictatorial, hegemonic kind of way, not quite the contrary, but that is a big, clear indication. This has come out the back of what's happened recently. So we have the whole Merkel thing. We've now got Tillerson coming out with these comments saying, actually, I'm not interested. I need to talk to these to China and Russia. Now, that's as big a slap in the face as you're going to get for the old paradigm, as I refer to it, and a move towards the new paradigm. I mean, can you ever imagine, if you'd said this a few years ago, that a US administration would do that? People would have laughed at you and said, that's never going to happen. It's not possible. Well, it's becoming very much reality now.
Yeah, absolutely, man. it is a reality. The fact of the matter is the West holds nothing anymore. No one's buying their nonsense. No one's buying their paper. It truly is a whole new world. It's a whole new world, and you know what? It is a slap in the face. It's we're going to bypass the club of the insolvent seven. We're going to bypass the welfare club that is called NATO, which has no new ideas. Their ideas are still stuck in the Cold War, Paul. Still on a Cold War mentality, And
absolutely,
their viewpoints on the geopolitical landscape is about as it's about as effective as Benjamin Netanyahu's viewpoint on the world in terms of his outlook on the world. That it's still like this is still 2,500 years ago.
well, it might be a good point to talk a bit about Israel, because obviously we had the incident where the Syrian army said there was these Israeli jets and they breached obviously Syrian airspace, and saying its air defense system, which the Russians gave them, of course, was shot down one of the aircraft and hit another one. And of course, the Israelis were denying it, saying, oh, that never happened. They didn't deny it. They ultimately admitted they were in Syrian airspace. But what subsequently came to light was that in the vicinity of where these Israeli airstrikes happened in western Palmyra, Russian advisors working with the Syrians observed this.
Mm.
And of course, what subsequently happened is then we had the Israeli defense minister saying Israel will not hesitate to destroy Syria's defense systems if the Israeli jets are ever targeted again. Well, then they were admitting they were targeted. At first, they said it never happened. And they said, the nations have to understand the context. If we strike, there's a real reason for it. Well, sorry, that doesn't, that's a nonsensical comment. But then he also said, the Israeli defense minister, oh, but by the way, we've no interest in intervening in the civil war in Syria. We're not either in favor or against Assad. So they started to kind of backtrack. And then, of course, what happened is Moscow summoned the Israeli ambassador to Russia and asked the question, what the hell were you doing in Syria, having these airstrikes? By the way, we observed them. And by all accounts, the Israeli ambassador got a major dressing down, is putting it politely. We could use other adjectives clearly in the process. Now, what then subsequently happened is the Israeli ambassador came out and said, well, we hope Russia will help avoid escalation in Syria amid the tensions that we're currently having with Damascus. So they went into absolute panic mode, because clearly the Russians said, excuse me, the world's changing. You're not doing that anymore, and don't think you can carry on just indiscriminately bombing whoever you think you're bombing.
Yeah.
And the question I would ask is, what were they doing having airstrikes in western Palmyra anyway, given that it's just been liberated from Daesh or ISIS or whatever else it is? So, I mean, we can't really comment exactly what happened, but clearly there was some major problem. And then just when Netanyahu's kind of reeling from that, the Chinese premier has affirmed China's support for the Iranian nuclear deal when he had a meeting with Netanyahu. So now you've got the Russians saying, well, I'm sorry, the Iranian nuclear deal's staying in place. The Chinese have said it. The Americans seem to have backed off in that regard. I mean, they may come out and say something in the future, but they seem to have gone very quiet about Iran. So Netanyahu's been, we're talking about isolating leaders. Look at what Merkel's doing. I mean, right. The same process, being isolated. And then just to really top it off, just when it couldn't get any worse for Netanyahu, apparently one of his lawyers has had to testify to police investigators concerning 2 criminal investigations in which Netanyahu is currently implicated. I mean, how many more punches to the head does Netanyahu have to get before he goes down? And this is the thing we're starting to see all around the world. Merkel, we've used that. We've just spoken, obviously, about Israel and Netanyahu. They're being isolated and backed into a corner. And, in days gone by, if the Israelis had gone in, for whatever reason, into Syria, conducted some airstrikes, it probably wouldn't have even made the media. No one would have talked about it. They would have just got away with it. And that would have been the end of it. Well, now, straight away, Moscow's on the phone going, what the hell do you think you're doing? you better get your ambassador straight down here immediately, and we're going to have a serious discussion about what's going on. And of course, the Israelis also came out going, this idea we're going to attack and destroy Syria's defense systems. Well, good luck trying that, because the reason they've got the Russian ones and everyone else has is because they're the best in the world.
Yes,
and because, of course, the other thing is, as soon as they invaded the airspace, Syria informed the Russians that this was happening and that what they were planning to do. And of course, the fact the Russian advisors were aware exactly what was going on and observed it would have just put more salt in the wound when the Israeli ambassador turned up, because they could say, we're not just getting hearsay here. It's not what the Syrians have told. We've observed it. Oh, I'm sorry, you probably weren't aware that we have all these operatives working with the Syrian army across the whole of Syria, which of course Russia does.
Yeah, absolutely correct. And the crazy thing is, it's what kind of airstrikes you're going to do in a battle space, in a theater of operations that has S-400 missile batteries there. You're not flying anything to that.
No, absolutely. I mean, yeah. And then of course we can't ever go each week by without not mentioning Erdogan in some capacity. And
our favorite Sultan. What is the Sultan up to now?
Well,
the Grand Vizier.
I mean, Turkey not only is kind of ordering all the S-400s, Turkey's now blocked military training and other work with NATO partner countries in an apparent, obviously, escalation of this diplomatic dispute with EU nations. So no wonder Erdogan wants the S-400 systems, but they've blocked NATO's 2017 rolling program of cooperation, including kind of political events, civilian projects, and military training. They're absolutely livid. So now, obviously, that's with non-EU countries, but the action is potentially going to affect all the NATO partners, including Sweden and nations such as that, which obviously contribute troops to NATO missions all over the world, including quite why they're in Afghanistan and Kosovo is interesting, but they are. So this is another major slap in the face for NATO, and the whole diplomatic spat that happened with Holland is having ramifications. People say, well, it's only Turkey, it's only Erdogan blowing hot air because he's got the 16th of April's this referendum and he's just trying to flex his muscle. No, he's absolutely serious. He's had enough. And of course, in the process, all Russia and China are doing is fine. You just get on with it. NATO is getting weaker and weaker. We spoke about the fact that NATO won't, and it did need reform. I mean, whether NATO survives at all is another matter, but NATO will have huge structural reform and become a defensive, organization rather offensive as it has been in the past. But Erdogan's another example of how weak NATO is becoming and how nations are just saying enough's enough and we've had enough. And if they were ever trying to drag Erdogan into the web of NATO and the EU, well, in the last week and a half or so, they've destroyed that totally now.
It's also funny that was it Angela Merkel's ally, Volker Buffer. Buffer was he's the chairman of Merkel's party, and he said that that Erdogan is no longer welcome in Germany.
Exactly.
Oh man, it's what is this? What is the Turkish referendum all about for the listeners, Paul?
Well, basically, it's that. Well, it's hotly disputed. There are a lot of people saying it'll just give Erdogan a lot more powers to do all manner of things, whatever he wants to do in his country. Well, the view is, I mean, people say, "Oh, the vote's going to be rigged," but the view is a lot of people seem to be, very, highly supportive of this measure. I think that comes out the back end of the coup. I know there's a lot of people in the West who've got very bent out of shape what he's done in his own nation in terms of removing people from office and arresting people, etc. But he became aware via the Russians just how insidious the infiltration into Turkey was. And I'm not defending Erdogan, anything he does, but it was clearly obvious that there was massive Western infiltration in his country, which is why the West thought the coup that failed was going to succeed and get rid of Erdogan, and hence the Russians tipped them off. Why Erdogan's suddenly new best friend was Putin, and occasionally Erdogan steps out of line and Putin gives him a bit of a slap and tells him to get back in line and behave himself. But in essence, yeah, it's more to do with just constitutional changes, which will give him more sweeping powers. Now, of course, people will say, well, that's a bad thing, and maybe ultimately it will be a bad thing. But we'll see what happens with regards to whether the Turkish people vote. But that was the whole purpose why they wanted to go to places like Holland and you know, canvass the people there, because there's a large Turkish population in Holland, as there is in Germany, and they should have just let it happen. It would have all blown over, nothing would happen. Instead, now we've got this major diplomatic spat that just highlights the huge deficiencies in the European Union. And of course, now it's spread into NATO. And in the process, as we said, Russia and China are just going, fine, that's great. Just, you know, just carry on what you're doing, because we don't care. We don't need to do anything. And this is the thing. There's a lot of things that there's a prioritization. Everything's very event driven in terms of how these changes are happening. So there's certain things. It'd be great to see certain people not in office anymore, but it's not really a priority. That's a contained issue. Isolating Merkel is the best thing you can do at the present time. Removing Merkel from office isn't irrelevant. So there's situations like that, and we're seeing how, from Russia and China's perspective, there's a containment of these problems. Yeah, there's other problems, and we have to go around the world. And I talked a lot in the podcast all about what's going on in North Korea and how all that kind of plays out from a US, Russia, kind of Japan. Well, I mean, without going into masses of detail, because I covered the whole podcast basically was devoted to this. The reality is, what they've done is they've now got a containment of North Korea. Now, and of course, immediately, because North Korea is now contained, they're coming out with this hot air, how they're going to incinerate the United States.
I see the videos, Paul. It's very convincing.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah, I mean, I believed it straight away. I was thinking, wow, they've actually... And these propaganda videos where they're apparently destroying US warships and, you know, it's all nonsense, but it's all hot air because it's a containment exercise. Now, whether, you know, the present administration stays in power or not is irrelevant. It's a containment exercise of getting it so you neutralize the effect of them. Because what the reality is, they're just looking for provocation. North Korea has always wanted some provocation. And of course, what subsequently now is there's the understanding. Just don't rise to the bait. Just ignore them. I mean, at some point, yeah, if they're going to launch a missile, then we have to take action accordingly. The reality is, and I don't want to tempt fate, but it's highly unlikely North Korea is seriously going to say, "Right, we're going to launch a missile to attack the US. We're going to launch a missile to attack China or anywhere else for that matter." It's just unlikely. But it's the whole process of containment and effectively stifling problems across the world. Now, in the past, of course, we've had the friction between Russia and China and the West, with with all due respect to the West, Russia and China saying, well, we need a more pragmatic view of how we deal with this problem, and the West going, no, let's just go in and blow everything up and see what happens as a consequence. Now there's more joined up thinking how we deal with these problems. It's neutralizing a lot of the issues rather than having to be directly confrontational, and that's part of the process. And that's why it is important that we don't just think, you know, I'm in the UK, what's going on in the UK? That's all that matters. Or I'm in the US, that's all that matters. Or whatever part of the world. It's a huge global event-changing process we're in. And everything that happens in different parts of the world has a huge consequential effect globally. So the fact the UK announces that inflation's at 2.3%, frankly, is irrelevant, because it's far higher. Yes, it's indicative that, you know, what they contained within Wall Street and obviously the City of London is now seeping out into Main Street. We know inflation's going through. It sounds very interesting, and it is on some level. But if I just focus on that, I'm missing the bigger picture, which is what's going on globally. And of course, we're now seeing how much the influence of that Trump is having in terms of US foreign policy, and there's a change. You know, people are saying, oh, well, you know, Trump wants to spend more on the military. He's going to spend another $50-odd billion for military expenditure and budget. Well, there's a perfectly good reason for that. But the one thing you don't hear a lot about, and that's something that came out, is that currently, the US nuclear arsenal is at the lowest levels it's been since the 1960s during the height of the Cold War.
Yeah.
I mean, that's an indication. I think everyone thinks that when we get to the new paradigm, we don't need military, we don't need, you know, any technology to defend nations. We absolutely do. It doesn't mean we're going to have the cabal stomping around the world, wreaking havoc and destroying nations and creating wars and world wars as they did in the past. there is still going to be threats for a period of time, and nations need to be equipped to deal with that. And the US absolutely has to be, because one of the major problems, and I know this from what was said to me as being factual, that the US forces were out in places like Iraq and Afghanistan actually trying to do a job. Not, everyone thinks they were there just doing nefarious things. No, they weren't. And their equipment was that useless.
Mm-hmm.
They couldn't do anything. They were just sitting ducks, which is why the US military got furious with the Obama administration. And when there are all these kind of stories of what they wanted the US military to do, and they kind of rebelled effectively against the administration. Well, it's no surprise what that's changing. The US military needs to have the equipment fit for purpose. And it doesn't mean that they're going to go to war every 5 minutes. It just means if there's a necessity. And in the future, X number of years down the line, we may have a global problem where some huge terrorist organization rears its head because someone decides they want to finance it because they're not happy with something. And no, it's not the cabal. There needs to be a global response. Well, there's no good the US going, well, actually, yeah, we'll help. But, oh, by the way, we've got no up-to-date equipment. We can't do anything to support that initiative. There may be a requirement for that. So we need to kind of get away from this idea, he's just wasting all this money. And the other point is, we always hear all these economic plans. There are no concrete economic budgetary plans in place. And just because he increases the spending in some, it doesn't mean he's increasing the overall spend. He's looking at slashing a lot of expenditure in the process. So it's realigning and redistributing money, which is what any nation should do, and something obviously the US hasn't done for a long time, hence why it has ridiculous $20 trillion nearly debt currently, and then in unfunded liabilities, you can add a zero on the end of that, or maybe even more. That's the process of not having any proper economic budgetary measures in place, where he will say, yeah, we need to spend here. Okay, so what are we going to do? We're going to cut a lot of wastage. And boy, we all know in every single country in the world, there's huge, enormous wastage that's gone on with regards to unnecessary expenditure, and for very, very nefarious reasons as well at times in that regard.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, what else, Paul, is on your radar as we're coming to the end of the broadcast?
Well, I think we probably could have talked a bit about, maybe we'll park it till next week, was the whole congressional hearing with Comey, because to be honest, there's a lot to talk about, and maybe we'll park that till next time, because that would probably take us another 20 minutes or so to kind of talk all about that.
Sure.
I mean, one thing that's interesting and probably worth mentioning, we talk about how there's moves to kind of regulate and audit, and there's been talks in the past about auditing the Federal Reserve. Well, there are moves afoot now to start to begin a process to have a proper audit of the European Central Bank, the ECB. Now, there's a body called the European Court of Auditors. Now, the ECB's argued for a period of time, or for a number of years, that they only have the authority to view the central bank's efficiency in terms of personnel and budgeting, which is not a lot really, not its decisions as, Europe's so-called notional top banking supervisor. Now, this European Court of Auditors has said, hang on, the ECB's used this to justify its refusal to turn over documents for review. Now, this is obviously, according to the European Court of Auditors, this has left a gap in oversight that actually ironically didn't exist until a couple of years ago. Because obviously that there was kind of moves put in place I felt at the time, to just shore up the lack of transparency in the ECB. Now, the ECB counter-argues and says, it's made a number of efforts to provide all this documentation and explanations. Well, clearly that's not correct. And ECB saying, well, we need to explore all options for closing this oversight gap. That's a polite way of saying we need to have complete transparency in the ECB. Now, for as far as I'm concerned, the die is being cast. You can expect the ECB to be fully audited at some point in the future, not necessarily. Don't expect it's going to happen next week or next month. But the fact is, there's a lot of noises coming out of Germany who want to see this change happening. Now, when you start to see the Germans want the ECB fully audited, that kind of tells you that is going to happen at some point. And it's another indication of why all these bodies, and there does need to be proper auditing. And someone will say, well, it doesn't really matter. Well, if you start to audit them, you're going to uncover a huge amount of, shall we say, clandestine kind of behavior that's been going on with, and it's the same also with the Federal Reserve, etc. It's very important that these kind of moves start happening. It seems a pretty innocuous piece of information coming out, but it's just the starting process. It's another domino that's going to get flipped amongst the thousands of dominoes that have to be flipped in terms of eradicating the insanity that's run particularly the Western world, but not exclusively, of course. And ECB is now starting to be on the ropes as well, because of course what always happens in these situations is when the European Union's on the ropes, they're immediately going to start, and then they're going to start lashing out at other entities. Of course, the ECB is not that popular with anybody. And then when it starts to be very unpopular with Germany, and it's also very unpopular with France, then immediately there's going to be repercussions. And I think that's why we're starting to see this cascading effect that comes as a result of this. But all central banks, the Bank of England, the same. There needs to be a complete audit and understand the kind of chain of command, what's been going on, how these banks have been cooperating, what they've been doing. And that'll go a long way to getting an understanding of exactly what's been going on in terms of, for example, what is the role of the Exchange Stabilization Fund, which actually controls the Federal Reserve. But there has to be, within the Federal Reserve, there'll be some process that can be audited that will explain things like that, as well as auditing the Exchange Stabilization Fund. So I think this is very, very important going forward.
Absolutely. Totally agree. With that being said, Paul, why don't you give out your website as well as your premium services and your YouTube channel so people could subscribe?
Well, first off, I'd like to thank yourselves at Rogue Money for all your support, and what V said's absolutely correct. They don't get a penny from this. They, got us on the radio shows, which we're very thrilled they have done, and they've been very supportive and helpful. And we have got quite a lot of premium content, subscribers as a result of it. But yeah, the website's thesiriusreport.com. That's SIRIUS. Obviously, we have it's a lot of free articles, and there's well over 100 on there. We do a news update section as well. And there is, yes, as you said, the premium content page. It's 5 podcasts a week, roughly 10 to 15 minutes. It's very condensed information. There's no waffle in it, so you'll get probably a longer period of time to listen to. A lot of people said it takes them 2 or 3 listens because it is that detailed, but we like to keep it. Brevity is everything as far as we're concerned. And that is an in-depth analysis of what's going on. It's geopolitical, it's economic. It costs $4.75 a month for whatever you're subscribing, whether it's pounds, etc., or euro. And we think it's very good value for money. You get roughly, obviously, 22 podcasts a month. We have the YouTube channel, that's London Paul. We've started to actually put out, last week was a weekly highlights, which in a very general overview of what we discuss in the podcast without giving away any of the information. But it's by design so people get an understanding of what you're likely to get. I mean, of course, it changes because we talk about many different subjects on a weekly basis. Yep. And obviously, we have the Facebook page, the Sirius Report as well. And again, we just want to thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to do the shows each week. I really enjoy doing it, and I think it works extremely well. And we just love doing these things.
Absolutely. Well said, Paul. And again, guys, check out the SiriusReport.com. Get the premium subscription service. It is a chock full of goodness. It's chock full of great intel, wonderful pieces. That Paul details the entire geopolitical spectrum, the news and information that matters. Go and subscribe. Go check it out and make it happen. And with that being said, guys, it's V, and CJ is running in the background. He's making sure this broadcast is coming out crystal clear. You can follow us on roguemoney.net, as well as our Twitter, which is at the Rogue Money, and our Rogue Money Facebook page. With that being said, we are over and out. Take it away, CJ.